So welcome everyone, and we are here online in the third webinar in a series of webinars and blogs about wicked problems in medical education. My name is Stewart Mennin, and I'm coming to you from Sao Paulo, Brazil. And I'm with Claire McRae, who is producing from Dundee, Scotland. And we welcome everyone who's online, and this will be recorded so that you may see it again. And the recording will be located at the web address that you can see on the screen now. It says it's bit.ly 32xpk1.
Stuart, I don't think you're sharing your screen yet.
Oh, okay, thank you. That would help. Let me see. Thank you, Claire. What would I do without you? So, how's that? Can you see now?
Yep, that's great.
Okay, so welcome. Where do wicked problems in medical education come from, and what can we do about it? Wicked issues are the norm in life. And the more we understand about them, the more progress we can make in medical education and clinical practice and in our daily lives. I've already written 4 blogs about wicked issues, and they are available free online, and this is the 3rd webinar about them. This is the address shown here for being able to listen to the webinars. So if you want to listen, here is the address here. So what I would like to do is first begin by thanking Glenda Oyang and Royce Holliday for their teachings that I have received and for the generous permission to use their work in this presentation. So I want to thank them and recognize their work. I have learned a great deal from them, and I'm very grateful. So today, in this webinar, we will explore several areas. I will review a little bit for those of you that are new to this subject, and then we'll extend further what we have been doing. So what is a wicked problem? And what are the characteristics of a wicked problem? And what does it mean that wicked problems are patterns? They're not just problems of impact, they're actual patterns that sustain over time and in space. And where do they come from? How do they originate? And what can we do about it? So this is the main focus of today's webinar. And it's important because much of medical education is about practice, and much about the practice of healthcare is practical. And there's very little theory that we grab onto and that we use in our practice. And one of the interesting things about what I'm going to be talking about is that it contains both theory and practice. They're not separate, and they are combined into a single entity. And when that happens, it's called praxis, P-R-A-X-I-S. So I'm going to be talking about simultaneously both the theory and the practice. And I think this has strong value in the world of medical education. So we begin by asking what? What is a wicked problem? And a wicked problem is any situation that causes difficulties for which there are no obvious, available, and known solutions. Any problem that is extreme or intractable or massively entangled and complex. And just as a simple example, here is a group of students. It could be residents, it could be people working in any group, but they're focused on an issue, on a problem, and they're all collaborating and working together on it. And if there's no obvious solution or no clear causality, it becomes a wicked problem. So it's a very simple way of thinking about wicked problems because there's no clear solution. The problem doesn't have a clear beginning, doesn't have a clear ending, doesn't have a solution that stays in place. And so whenever we're working in groups, and most of healthcare and medical education takes place in groups, working in groups, collaborating in teams, committees, these are wicked problems. So whenever people get together and need to do things, we encounter wicked problems. And that includes teaching and doing very different things, because wicked problems look different to each person. So every person who's in this group or in this interdisciplinary healthcare team illustrated below, every person who is working together, whether they're in a group or whether they're in an interdisciplinary team, see the problem differently. Everyone has a different idea, a different perspective. And you hear this all the time when people say, well, let me see if I understand what you're saying. Are you saying that? Or what I hear is, or my understanding is. And so these are clues that everyone sees the problem differently. And not only do they see it differently, but everyone comes from a different context. Everybody's life is different. It brings them to the problem at this particular moment from a different place with a different set of values. Yet the patterns that we will talk about, the pattern of the problem is similar across contexts. For example, resistance to change in a new curriculum. It looks one way at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine and takes the form of resistance to teaching change or to other kinds of changes in assessment or whatever. And resistance to change looks different at the University, Flinders University in Australia. It's still resistance to change, but it looks different. It looks different at the University of Boston. It looks different everywhere. So context dependent defines what it looks like for you in your place, but the pattern of resistance is consistent across contexts. And finally, this is impossible to solve. There is no fixed solution here. There is no solution that works in New Mexico, that works in Australia, that works in Boston. You cannot transfer solutions in wicked problems, nor can you scale them up. So whatever works in one place cannot be transferred to another place. It just doesn't work that way. And that's different than problems that lend themselves to clear, definitive solutions. So where do these kinds of problems, these wicked problems, where do they actually come from? Now, this is the fourth blog in a series of blogs that are meant to be developmental. So if you're coming into this blog as your first blog in this series, it may be beneficial for you to review blogs 1, 2, 3, and 4, available as I showed on the first slide, and I'll show again the availability on the last slide. So wicked problems originate through several conditions. They originate by interactions of agents. Agents is a computerized term. It could be people. So they're represented by geographic shapes and colors. Here's an agent, here's an agent, here's an agent. All these agents then, orange, green, purple, etc. These are agents. Now they could be students in a small group, in a team-based or problem-based learning, different students. They could be different members of a department of obstetrics and gynecology. Or they could be different members of, or different departments in a clinical setting. They could be different communities in a community served by a single health service. And they can be different health services in a region, and they can be different regions in a country, and they can be mixtures of all of those things. So this diagram represents differences amongst participants. In computer simulations, they're called agents, and that's kind of the language that evolved in the literature. And these agents are in a system together. A system is defined as any group of things that are held together in some common purpose or configuration. A system is like a community. It's a group of things that share commonalities. It's not more complicated than, more difficult than that. So this system, as you can see, has boundaries in these purple lines that I'm outlining right now. these purple lines hold these agents inside a container like a cup or a bowl, but it's open at the top. It's not closed. So wicked problems are bounded, the agents are held together in an open system. That is, they're bounded, yet the system is open, and they are contained within a container, and they interact as they are constrained within these containers. So these things interact with each other in ways that they would be different if there was no boundary. They would float away, or they would not be contained and close to one another. So, and you can see from this diagram that there are two boundaries, and that some of the agents or people or ideas or issues are in more than one container. So you have a container here that holds things together so they can interact. And you have differences amongst the people or the ideas, etc. So it's really important that we understand that wicked problems arise from the behavior of agents in a constrained system that's open. You can think of a cell as having a membrane around it that's open to the outside. It's semi-permeable. It's semi-permeable to calcium. It's semi-permeable to transmitters. It's semi-permeable to sodium, to potassium, other ions, and for ligands that are internalized. If it's a steroid, it's endocytosed into the nucleus. So things can come in and out of cells, and yet the cell can still maintain its integrity. That's an example of a system that's open to the outside, but selectively, and within which contents are held together. So it's very common to see this. We are now bounded together, you and I, through the internet. You are looking at your screen, I'm looking at my screen, and we're held together by electronic communication, but you're free to turn it off and walk away. I'm free to turn it off and walk away. So the system is open to the outside, yet it's we are held together in this moment. We have a shared container, that is, we're held together by this webinar. So it's an important point. And let me erase all these drawings. And so what you see is that you can see the agents here, and the agents interact, and what happens when the agents interact, they reach a certain tension. They reach a threshold of tension so that what's holding them in place can no longer work, and they break out spontaneously and form a new structure. This is called self-organization. So that agents that are bounded together interact, and their differences and the interaction of those differences create tension and energy. And when the container can no longer sustain or no longer hold them, the agent's interaction creates new patterns system-wide. This is called self-organization. Right, let me type this to be better. This is called self-organization. This is the origin of wicked problems. Self-organization is a process that's internal to a system. It's not created by outside influences. I'll give you an example why that's true. If you are a teacher or a clinician, you can be a fabulous teacher and a great preceptor and a clinician, and provide outside influence to a group of learners or to a learner. However, if that learner is not ready to learn, it doesn't matter how good your external input is, the conditions within the learner are not receptive, and that learner is not ready, and they don't learn. So that the internal conditions have to be prepared and correct for self-organization to occur. And that correctedness is tension, difference. If I was in a small group in problem-based learning, and all the students were were twins. There was quintuplets. They were all identical. It would be very difficult to make progress in the group because the lack of differences would not provide a richness of understanding. It's the differences amongst the students that provides the quality and the richness of difference in points of view of learning objectives. It's the difference in a clinical team. The difference is within the container of an interdisciplinary and a multi-professional group that give strength to a team. And so it's differences that make possible change. And those differences are constrained or held in a container and they interact. And that process gives rise to new structures. And those new structures are what we see as change. And a wicked problem emerges from those dynamics. These circles at the top represent a wicked problem of any kind. It could be resistance to change in a curriculum. It could be students complaining about the assessment. It could be faculty complaining about the amount of time they have to teach and the lack of clinical time, etc. So this image here illustrates that there are people in groups that interact, and their interaction results in a tension or a change that can no longer stay or fit in the configuration they're in, and something new happens, a new idea, a new learning objective comes out, a new perspective on a problem emerges. And that perspective then comes around and influences the individuals subsequently as they move on. So what you see is agents interacting, giving rise to new ideas and new structures, and those structures influencing the agents, and those agents continuing in a repetitive cycle. And you see this process of self-organized change. And to understand the relationship of wicked problems to this, it becomes important to observe the following. And then I'll pause for some questions. Here we have the same diagram. We have people interacting to create a new pattern that influences the people. This is the standard idea of how change happens in complex systems. It's not an impact change where this orange circle interacts with this pink circle, and as a result of that, something happens directly, like a ball hitting another ball, and it moves forward. Doesn't work like that. These are many, many, many interactions, and so it's a different system. It's a complex adaptive system. And the fact is that the patterns that we see up above here, the system-wide patterns above that we see, are created by human behaviors. Human behaviors create patterns. So the members in a group working on a team-based issue or in a problem-based learning or in a clinical setting or in the hospital team, the behaviors of the people in the team or in the department or in the school or in the community, those behaviors of people create a larger system-wide pattern that we observe of community health, of group behavior, of team behavior. And where do behaviors come from? I'm not going to get into movement causality in this talk, but behaviors come from implicit and explicit rules or behavioral rules that people follow. So let me pause for a moment. Well, let me see, just a second. Yeah, one more slide. So here's an example of how this works. And I use the example of my family. Let me erase everything. So in my family, when I was a boy, we had to be at the dinner table. And these are 4 images of dinner tables from different parts of the world. So we had simple rules in my family, and some were explicit and some were implicit. So for example, at dinner time, which was usually 6 o'clock, I grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and I was always out in the street playing. At dinner time, I would know at 6 o'clock I had to be back inside my house with my hands washed at the dinner table, ready to eat. And if I was dirty, I had to change my clothes, which was often the case. Now, my grandmother, who lived with us, also knew that at 6 o'clock she had to be at the dinner table. So the same rule applied to her, and it applied to my parents, especially my father, who had to be home from work at 6 o'clock, ready to eat. So everyone knew the same simple rule, but it affected everyone differently. I had to come in from playing. My grandmother had to stop knitting or sewing. My mother finished cooking. My father had to get home in time for dinner. My sister had to be at the dinner table. And so in each of these pictures, you see a family having a meal together, and the rules for each family are different, but there are rules of eating that each family follows. These simple rules, whether they're explicit, be home at 6, or implicit, make sure that you're clean, you wash your hands. My mother wouldn't want to have to tell me the rules every day. So after a while, I knew the rules without having to be told, and I would just get there. And if I didn't, I'd get yelled at or punished. So rules can be explicit and implicit, and they drive or promote behaviors. So everybody migrates towards the dinner table, sits down, and is ready to eat. This is a system-wide pattern, a group of individuals sharing a common system or goal. So an implicit rule or an explicit rule promotes behaviors of individuals. And those individuals each behave in a way that brings them together in a pattern. So simple rules or guidelines create behaviors of individuals. And when those individuals carry out that behavior, it becomes a pattern. And if that pattern happens to be something you don't like, you'll call it a wicked problem. So I want to pause here and open up discussion in the chat space or online if people want to speak, and make sure that everyone has an opportunity to ask questions or comment. I want to make sure that I haven't confused you all totally. Claire, what are you seeing in the chat space?
So just one question at the moment, which was, how are wicked problems different from being in a state of dissonance?
A state of dissonance could be a wicked problem, and it could be what a tame problem. The opposite of wicked problems is tame problems. So the difference between a dissonance or a lack of harmony, it could be mechanical and it could be complex. However, a wicked problem has to be complex. So dissonance is the disagreement between two things. And if it's a problem that can be solved by fixing it, for example, feedback from a speaker, I can turn the knob down, and the knob on the volume of the speaker is directly proportionate to the amount I turn. It's linear. The more I turn it, the lower the volume gets. In dissonance, in a musical sense, if two instruments are playing together and it sounds dissonant, they're playing notes that are not pleasing to the ear, they can just stop and the two notes go away. So it's easy to find. There's a beginning and an end to dissonance. If the dissonance takes the place, I view dissonance, I view corruption as a form of dissonance, and I view pollution as a form of dissonance. So let's say the dissonance between clean air and polluted air. So now we can call dissonance a difference. Dissonance is the difference between two things. Okay, when that difference is excessive and we feel it's harmful, then we cover our ears, or we put a mask on for pollution, or we behave in particular ways. So dissonance could be a wicked problem if it is so big that we can't manage it. Dissonance that can be managed and fixed is a tame problem. I'm not sure if I'm helping with the answer to this question. It has to do with how many things are involved and whether or not they're in an open or a closed system. Okay, if the noise is inside a radio, it's a mechanical problem. It's a closed system and can be fixed. If the dissonance is in an open system that's bounded but open to the outside, has many, many agents that are interacting with each other, and many, many differences, then the dissonance is a wicked problem. Does that help?
Sami has added to that, Stewart, and I think it's a very good point, that dissonance, which really is just a disharmony, can usually be solved if you can get to mutual agreement, whereas wicked problems can't just be solved by having an agreement on them.
Right. And Sammy's point is important because when there's two agents involved, the chances of finding some resolution are reasonably good. When there's 5, 6, 7 agents involved and they're all involved in different ways, it's much more difficult. It's complex. So the number of differences and the degree to which they're held together makes an important factor in difference between things. If the differences are very high and the container is open, it's wicked. If the differences are low, 1 or 2, and they're contained tightly, then it's a tame problem. Thank you, Sammy. Thank you. Other comments or questions before we go on?
There's just one other comment in there at the moment that I thought was quite interesting, that Mishan, I think, says wicked problems might actually be critical to progress or improvement in a system, and in that sense they might actually be inevitable, so we need them to move on.
Thank you, Mishan, and I'm glad you're here. Yes, I agree with you. Progress comes from difference. When we have something that's replicated, Xeroxed, if you need replication to solve a problem, then it has a beginning and an end. So if I need 200 copies of this talk, I just duplicate the 200 copies and send them out. But if I want to give this talk 200 times, you can bet that it's going to be 200 different talks. Especially those of you who know me, I never say the same thing twice. And I never repeat a talk, even if it's the same one. So progress requires difference. I think that's the key point from Mishan's comment. And it's inevitable, and I'll tell you why difference is inevitable, because the world turns around every day. The sun comes up and goes down every day. The seasons change. I grow older a little bit every day. My children get older every day. The weather changes every day. The crops in a particular season change. The availability of marketplaces changes. The number of students and their origins and their interests that come to medical school changes every day. The flow of patients into a clinic changes with seasons and with different things, so that dissonance and disagreement and differences are a constant. And so Mishan's correct that everything that happens, that we make progress, is based on difference. And dissonance is just a lot more difference. It's another form of difference. Even harmony is difference, but it's pleasing difference. Dissonance is difference that may not satisfy your values. So, Mishan, thank you for that comment. Anything else, Claire, before we go on?
There is a question from Tegbar, and I wonder if you might actually want to leave this till later in the webinar. It's what would we actually get out of the concept of wicked problems? What are the practical implications of them?
Yes. Tegbar, I'll just answer you quickly, and if the answer doesn't become more practical for you as we go on, I would like you to return with this question until you're satisfied. Okay? So when you have wicked problems, the practical utility of knowing about them is that you don't try to solve them with tame or simple answers. When you have a wicked problem, you can't solve it. You can work with it. If you try to solve it, you fail. And you fail miserably, and you waste resources, and you get frustrated with it. If you work in medical education, you know about frustration. And a lot of frustration and stress in medical education is because people are using wrong methods or inappropriate methods for the problems they're facing. They're trying to solve things that can be managed but not solved. So let me go on and see if this question becomes more clear. The origin of, to make sure I'm in the right place. Yes, the origin of the behaviors that lead to wicked problems is in simple rules. And so in this case, I want to show a kind of a causality. A simple rule like be at the dinner table at 6 p.m. guides my behavior and sets the principles of my family and the behavior of my family, so that at 6 o'clock, there is a pattern in my family that everybody's at the table. That's the people at a table are a pattern. If somebody's missing, the pattern is different. So if I want to understand the pattern, so if I start with a system-wide pattern, here, Tegbar, this becomes important. If you have a wicked problem, Tegbar, like resistance to change in a medical school program, or failure to achieve institute-wide assessment, or faculty development that doesn't quite work. It only works for those people that show up, and the people that don't show up don't get the faculty development, and therefore the system is incomplete. So if you can see the pattern of an incomplete faculty development program or whatever, and you want to know what are the behaviors that give rise to this problem, what are the simple rules that everyone is following implicitly or explicitly? Because if you can't change people's behaviors. You can't change someone else. You can only change yourself. I know that sounds dogmatic, but it happens to be true. If you haven't learned that one, you keep working at it, you'll get there. It's a very painful lesson to learn. What you can change are the conditions, the simple rules that people then follow. People choose to follow the conditions. So a simple rule like be at the dinner table with your hands washed. If it was be at the dinner table between 6 and 8 p.m., then suddenly the pattern at the dinner table is more episodic, more sporadic. I could be at the dinner table alone. I could be at the dinner table with just my grandmother. And there's no way to know every day who's going to be there. So in a small group, if the students don't agree in a problem-based group or a team-based group or a clinical group, show up on time, be ready to go. Make sure you've done the learning objectives or you've prepared whatever needs to be prepared. You've done the clinical labs and you're ready to roll. If you're not ready, then the whole team's behavior is affected. So individual behavior sets system-wide patterns. And individual behavior comes from your sense of obligation, ethics, beliefs that guide your own behavior. And those we call simple rules. Does that help? Is that clear? Claire, does that make sense to you? Okay, I don't want to beat it too hard, but it's really important because simple rules help individuals make decisions for themselves. And Tegbar, it's the decisions that each individual in a faculty department or a school of medicine make that determines the pattern of the curriculum and the teaching. The simple rules involve everyone on the faculty and can or cannot create a coherent system-wide pattern. So the coherent system-wide pattern could be dysfunctional. It doesn't mean that simple rules don't mean that everything is nice and wonderful. It could mean that everything's incoherent and doesn't work. There's no valence on simple rules. There's no simple rules are good. Not simple rules is not good. You can have simple rules that lead to dysfunctional behavior. People have studied gangs, violence in gangs, in cities all around the world, and they find there are simple rules in gangs. There's simple rules in warfare. There's simple rules in criminal activity. There's simple rules in ethical activity. So it's that simple rules are what guides individual behavior, and the individual behaviors create system-wide patterns. This is the key to understanding where wicked issues, wicked problems come from. The simple rules can be implicit or explicit. We've discussed that. Implicit meaning I know them, I do them, but I don't know what they are. For example, everybody learns. It's not printed on the wall, but it's understood that everybody who comes to medical school learns. Or everyone who enters a doctorate program is supposed to learn. If you don't learn, you're not there. So in health professions education, we could make some simple rules. Here's some simple rules that I've experienced in my time. Teach and learn. Everybody learns all the time in a medical school, in a medical program. You're supposed to be a learner. In a curriculum, use authentic settings and stories, things that make sense to students and teachers and are relevant. Assume responsibility for both your individual and group learning. So you're not just responsible for yourself, you're responsible for others as well. Focus on understanding clinical experience. So you're not just a robot saying, okay, look at this. Okay, if I see this, I have to, if I see A, I must do B. If I see A, then what do I understand about A and how does that lead me to B is a much more productive way of learning to be a professional. And authenticity, early and sustained authentic ways of promoting curriculum. When I went to school, we were told, learn this. And when I was studying anatomy, we were told, learn this anatomy. And one day it'll be useful for you. And if you don't learn it, one day you'll kill somebody. So there was this huge, learn it now, trust me, I'm your teacher, and one day you'll realize it was helpful. Well, that one day never shows up because when it does, I can't remember any of that stuff. And so it was a very frustrating experience. And integrate the sciences basic to medicine throughout the curriculum and in practice. These are simple rules that if you follow them, lead to behaviors that create system-wide patterns. Ask questions at the frontier or at the edge of your understanding. If you had a school or a curriculum or a clinic that ran by these rules, it would be very different than what you have now, assuming you don't have these now. And finally, stay engaged in your community. So it really becomes important that you understand the power of simple rules. Tegwar, this should begin to make sense to you now, that simple rules which create wicked problems are very powerful. So if you don't know the simple rules or you're not in touch with them, they don't become explicit at some point, you end up behaving in ways that make no sense to you and you can't figure out how to follow them. So simple rules are really important in guiding behavior that create system-wide patterns. How do we identify and name simple rules? And by the way, there's no hard and fast reason why they should be called simple rules. Some people call them guidelines. Some people call them basic assumptions. The literature in complexity and in the area in which this comes from, they call them simple rules. Some people object to that and they're free to change the terminology. But simple rules come from, you have to observe a pattern, be able to spot a pattern. And in that pattern, then it's created from behaviors. So for example, I'm working in a medical school in Sao Paulo, and the faculty, the directors have decided there'll be a curriculum change to more active learning. And the teachers say, yeah, and the students say, that would be great. And then when it comes to implementing active learning, the teachers still give lectures in small groups, and the students are upset that it's not any better than it was before. It might even be worse. And so while there's an explicit rule, the implicit interpretation is not clear. And they do faculty development, and it still doesn't work. And so you have a wicked problem that originates by the misinterpretation of a simple rule. So it's very important that you figure out the implicit rules that create the problem. And in this case, one of the implicit rules amongst faculty members could be do your own thing. If the faculty members in your medical school don't feel constrained to follow the institutional rules or the accreditation rules or the outcome rules or the competency rules, and they're autonomous. They can do whatever they want. After all, who's going to tell them not to? So you need to figure out what the rules are and then consider the patterns that exist now. What patterns exist now as wicked issues in your workplace? Or what patterns would you like to create? It goes both ways. You can look at what is, and you can look at what you want to create. And then you can generate a set of rules to support behaviors to create those patterns. So for example, if the rule is do your own thing, and that creates fragmentation and dissonance in your curriculum, in your school, and you change it to do your own thing collaboratively with others, make your own thing collaborative, then suddenly you have people working together as opposed to alone. And the behavior leads to different patterns. This should begin to see the importance of understanding simple rules, behaviors, and patterns as the origin of wicked problems, Tegbar. And each working group finds its own simple rules. So what are the questions? What can we do to identify a pattern? Not everybody can see the pattern that's going on in front of them. So let's take an example. A small group of students working in problem-based learning or team-based learning, or even a clinical preceptorship group, a case-based learning, a curriculum. We observe that case-based learning or any group learning is inconsistent from week to week or day to day between students, teachers, and groups. And we want to be able to understand what that pattern is about. And so we're going to ask 5 questions. We're going to ask 5 questions to help spot the pattern that we're dealing with. The first question is a generalization question. And we're going to say, in general, I observe, or in general, I noticed, for example, that the students are actively engaged with and inquiring about learning. Or the clinicians, the postgraduate students are actively engaged in seeing patients and seem to be learning. In general, that's what I observe. Except, in general, I observe that they're engaged in learning, except some students prefer to learn in lectures or by themselves, or some teachers prefer to teach in lecture halls and not in small groups. So generally it's working, but there are exceptions. And there are contradictions. On one hand, I see some students and teachers dominate the discussions. And I put that together in my mind with learning. And yet, on the other hand, there are quieter students or individuals that make meaningful contributions and learn well. So there's an apparent contradiction that I'm seeing. And I'm surprised by the large variability in small group teaching skills. I would expect the objectives and all that would hold things more tightly together. I'm surprised by that. And what puzzles me, and I wonder, how is curiosity sustained by individuals and groups? In general, I notice except on one hand, I see this, and on the other hand, I see that. I'm surprised by, and I wonder, when you ask these 5 questions of any wicked problem, you can have the pattern of that problem in front of you. If you have a wicked problem of your colleagues don't collaborate with you, or the hierarchy is not supportive, or whatever it is, this can work to your advantage. So being able to indicate and find patterns. So how does one make simple rules? A simple rule begins with a verb that tells you what to do. It doesn't tell you what to think or what to say. Recognize contributions of others is different than think about the contributions of others or understand contributions or recognize. It's kind of like making objectives with action verbs. You should have no more than 7 simple rules for any wicked problem and a minimum of 3. And there's a reason for that, which I'll discuss in the next blog. And the wicked rules, the simple rules have to work for everyone. So if I'm a teacher, the wicked rules, the simple rules have to apply to the teachers, all the students, the administrator, the staff, the directors, the deans. Everyone should be aware of and following the same simple rules for it to work. And they should be reviewed and revised. And it includes rules that set conditions, that is, set the terms of reference for patterns. And finally, this includes what's called the container differences and exchanges, which we've mentioned in past blogs, and I'll mention again briefly here and in the next blog. Actually, let me see the next slide. Yes, so simple rules for learning. Here's an example of a simple rules for learning that I currently follow and I recommend for you. Simple rules: engage in inquiry, be curious, ask questions. This can work for the administrator, for the dean, for the faculty, for the chairman of the department, for the students, for the workers that work in the office. Be curious, engage in inquiry. Take the energy of difference and leverage it for learning. The dissonance can be turned into learning. Create coherence in the small parts you have, in the group, and in the greater whole. So coherence refers to the fact that what you see happening at one level happens at another level, happens at another level. So if I am doing teach and learn in every interaction, then I see my teachers doing teach and learn in every interaction. And I see the regents when they have a meeting, or the directors of the school, they are teaching and learning each other in their own way, in their own context. So these rules apply across levels of organization, but at each level of organization, the context is different. So for the regents, their context is different than for the students, yet they're still engaged in learning and teaching. So simple rules fit different contexts and hold across contexts. This is what makes them different than anything else. And we like to connect through stories and impacts. So most human dialogue is storytelling. This happened and that happened and she said and he said and then this. And so we tell stories, and it's a good way to talk about what's going on. Even clinical diagnosis is storytelling. Well, this happened and this happened and this happened. And search for what's true and useful. Something, I've had classes from teachers that presented their detailed research that had nothing to do with the course that I was taking. And their research was true, but it wasn't useful for the course that I was taking. So we need to be both true and useful, and we need to engage in joyful practice. And this may seem silly to some people. If you think that learning has to be painful, then it seems silly for you, but you can actually enjoy learning, and it should be a joyful practice. So this slide summarizes what we've been talking about. This slide shows that simple rules drive behaviors that drive system-wide patterns, and the simple rules apply to the agents that interact and create new patterns, and those new patterns influence subsequent behaviors of agents. This is where wicked issues come from. And so change happens when a system can no longer sustain the accumulated tension. I love this slide. It just says everything all at once. So when there's too much tension, then change happens. If it's just right, then it's level. And if it's not enough, then it's too easy to go forward. So change has to do with the dynamics of the balance between tension and the capacity to hold that tension. So change happens when the tension in the system is too much for the system to hold it. Here's an example of change in a river in the Amazon Delta in Brazil. If you look at this river, it meanders around like this. This meanders around. There's resistance to flow along the shore. So the river bends at this point, and it bends. So there's resistances all along the way. But if you came back 6 months later, the bend would be in a different place. The land would have changed. The resistance would have changed, and the pattern of the river would be different. So patterns emerge through changes in resistance. There could be different foliage. There could be different biology going on. Differences could create changes in flow. And there could be a spill of detergent in the water that would affect the algae, and the algae could clog the river. So what happens here is that we talked earlier about boundaries. You have containers and boundaries. Here we have containers, and here we have the shoreline is the container here. The competencies are the containers, and accreditation are the containers in a medical curriculum. The differences are tension. Here the differences are weight, and the tension is clear. Here the differences are resistance along the shore. And in a medical school, in a curriculum, what are the differences? The differences between students, the differences between tests, the differences between performances in different years, the changing accreditation values, new outcomes, new competencies. And so it's necessary to talk and exchange information. So the container that bounds things together, the differences that create tension, and the exchange of that tension are the three conditions that influence the ability of a system to organize and do what it needs to do. And how can we influence that? What can we do about it? And this is something we've talked about in previous blogs. And I refer you to the first two blogs for more detailed discussion. Here we have what's called adaptive action. This is how you move. This is how you move a wicked problem. A wicked problem can be influenced by asking a question. What do I observe? What's going on? Patient comes in. What's the data? What's the history? What's the lab? A problem is presented to a research team. What does the literature say? What's the history? What do we know? What equipment do we have? What can we replicate? What can we test? A wicked problem arises in a small group learning situation. What's the history of the problem? What is our understanding of the problem? What do we already know about the problem? What? So a series of questions that open up the situation that it's a discovery process. The questions of what are discovery processes. What do I know? What do I need to understand? What's going on? Once you discover what's going on, then you find yourself drawn into a meaning making. What does it mean? What is the significance? Well, I can't write with a pen, much less a cursor. So what does it mean for me? So what does it mean for you? So what does it mean for the faculty team I'm working with? So what does it mean for the members of my student group? So what does it mean for my class? So what does it mean for my preceptor? And what does it mean for the group of preceptors with whom I'm working? And what does that group of preceptors and that mean for the clinic and the community and where we're working, or the ambulatory clinic or the hospital? So making meaning of what you discover is an essential pathway, and we do it in diagnosis all the time. What did you learn from the history and the physical and the lab? What meaning do you make? What pattern does it remind you of? And if it doesn't remind you of a pattern that you can clearly identify, then you need more information. And so you go to, now what? Now what more information do I need? What will I do? I'll order more tests. I'll discuss this with a colleague. I'll go online and see what the literature says. I'll try a presumptive treatment and see if things change and get better. And I'll follow a very powerful, simple rule in medicine. Do no harm in medicine is a simple rule. All care providers in all different contexts all follow the simple rule, do no harm, including nursing, pharmacy, medicine, community practice, mental health workers, everybody, do no harm. Another simple rule would be keep your patient's information confidential, respect confidentiality. So we live with simple rules all the time, and we can act and make progress with them by following adaptive action. They work for wicked and simple problems in diagnosis. They work in evaluation and assessment. These questions work in and across contexts and at different scales. So here's an example of a complex set of issues. Adaptive action works in simple, complicated, and complex situations. It works in diagnosis, it works in research, it works in learning, and it works in anything you wish to do. If you ask these three questions and flesh them out, as in the previous three blogs, you will find that you can advance even if you don't know the answer. You will find you can make progress without an answer. When an answer is not available, when answers are not sufficient, then the best thing you can do is ask well-formed questions. What we try to teach students in research at all levels is that asking questions is the best way to learn. When I go into somebody's laboratory or clinic, the first thing I say is, what questions are driving your interests here? So this process of what, so what, now what is iterative, and it keeps rolling forward in an iterative way. Once you ask a what question and a so what, and then you do something, once you do something, you've changed the situation so that you can ask a new what, a new so what, a new now what. And once you take a now what, it takes you to a new. And so this is an iterative process, and it keeps rolling forward. And this is how you deal with wicked problems, using simple rules to make progress. And so, and I like this, I'm going to share a quote with you that I liked very much. And it deals with the fact that things don't happen in a straight line. Progress in life and in science is not a simple line leading to the truth. It is more progress away from less adequate conceptions of and interactions with the world. We make progress, Tegbar, wicked issues help you move away from less adequate conceptions and interactions with the world to more meaningful ones, even if you don't have the right answer. And so I want to pause here and ask, what questions do you have about where wicked problems come from, how simple rules influence what happens, and how we can work with that? So I'll pause here. Let me go back to one slide to here so I can get the dynamics. Here, this part. This slide is a summary slide. Let me pause here and open up the chat space. And let's see, where is that? Yes. Claire, what do we see in the chat space?
Well, I think everybody has been very busy listening, Stuart, because there's not a lot of chat here, but I would like to invite people, if you actually want to ask a question, please just unmute your microphone and go ahead. We had a very brief discussion about problem-based learning in the context of simple rules, and I think that's a really nice example. I've seen a lot of times PBL has failed because PBL requires some really quite clear and explicit rules to be followed, but actually we've got some really heavily ingrained rules, implicit ones about what teachers ought to do and what students ought to do in terms of transmitting information.
Yeah, I actually think that PBL failed as a methodology over the course of 20 to 30 years because it got reduced to steps. And I think the people who made step 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and a lot of that was replicated out of Maastricht. They said, and they did that because people had trouble learning PBL in the beginning, and they needed, because they were practitioners and scientifically minded, they needed step 1, step 2, step 3. And what happened was that became the mantra rather than the entree. The mantra was, okay, listen, we need to move to step 4 now. What's somebody look up, what's step 4? Okay, we need to do. The fact is you do all the steps all the time, repeatedly, coming in and out, back and forth, up and down. And when you make a complex process into a straight line of steps, it fails. And that's the story of PBL. And virtually anything in medical education that becomes fashionable, I will say that entrustable professional activities is on the same course as PBL. Entrustable professional activities started with Ola Tenkat as a fabulous conception. And now it's being reduced into milestones and minor, smaller and smaller parts so that people can get a handle on it. And it's going to be the demise of entrustable professional activities. It's going to fall out of fashion because people will try to measure the small things and then add them up into the total, and it won't work. So I think it's really important to understand the wholeness of wicked problems and not break them up into parts and steps like in PBL. And that has to do with simple rules. Simple rules cross context. They don't stay fixed in one context. Other questions and comments, Claire?
I think there was just one other comment really about how wicked problems can look different depending on who you are. So what the teacher sees as the problem might be different from what the course director sees as the problem, and that can be a wicked problem in itself.
Yeah, well, early on, one of the things we said about wicked problems is they look differently to different people, and different people have different perspectives. And it's true. And the fact that you don't understand that makes a big problem for us. And so looking at the clock, I'm just about out of time. And here I want to say on the last slide, and these will be available online at the blogs, and the webinars will be available here. I made a new bit.ly so you can find all three at once. This is the AMEE website on webinars, and this is the page that lists all the blogs and the webinars. You can find them all here. And so, and I've made some recommendations for reading. Here's a bit.ly for reading, and here's a book for reading. And here's an institute to explore. Our next blog will be in December, and look for a notification of it. I want to thank Claire for co-producing and helping me with the chat and being my support mate in this production and helping in all kinds of ways. And I want to thank all of you that have been online, and Tegbar, especially those of you that I have interacted with before. And the rest of you, please read the other blogs if you wish, and write to me. I'm be happy to interact with you about your wicked issues. And in the next month or so, look for a MedEd published article on wicked issues in medical education. Should be coming out if I can get past the editorial issues, which are administrative. That should be happening. And with that, I want to close the hour and thank everyone for being online today, and I hope this was beneficial. And I hope to be able to be back with you again soon. So thank you very much. Thank you, Claire. And if you could terminate the recording. I'll stay here for a few minutes if people want